Hey guys, good evening. Welcome to Grieving Hearts, our second virtual Grieving Hearts, tonight with Christy Mcmillan. And for those of you who have been following along and participating in Grieving Hearts, we've been partnering with Christine for 4 years now, and she has been serving our community for over 25 years in different capacities. And today she holds her own practice, where she serves many of our clients from Families First and many additional clients throughout the City of Windsor and the County of Essex. So we're super happy to continue our partnership with Christine, and it comes at a pretty important time when we still need people to have hope, and we need to serve our families who are grieving, who have experienced a loss during this difficult time. And so if you are tuning in tonight, we welcome you. And we know that this will be a night that will offer some healing and will offer perspective. And as always, we want to welcome Christine and thank her for her service to the community. So without further ado, I welcome Christy Mcmillan, and on behalf of our team at Families First, we thank you for joining us tonight, as we know that lots of good things will come from this. So good evening, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. And here we go, Christine.
Thank you so much, Jen. I'm bringing in my chair with my pillow because I'm vertically challenged. Thank you for that introduction. That's very kind of you. I want to thank you also for you and your team for the wonderful work that Families First continues to do in the community for our bereaved. And I am honored to be affiliated with such a wonderful organization, and to be able to share what is normal in grief, to be able to offer you some support. So I am very grateful to be affiliated with Families First through Grieving Hearts. So our first Grieving Hearts virtual presentation get-together was probably about 10 weeks ago. And I don't know about you, but at about that time, the physical distancing restrictions and how we had to kind of do business was just being implemented. And when Families First came to me and asked me to provide services virtually, I thought, well, this is probably a good alternative in the interim. And I thought at that point in time, it would be for a short period of time. Well, here we are, 10 weeks later. I'm shocked, I'm surprised. Maybe I naively thought that this would be over. Maybe I didn't keep up with the evidence out there. Maybe I was in denial. And that's not unlike the grief process, where we anticipate that it's going to be much quicker. It's going to be much less painful than it is. And we find as time goes on that actually that's not the case. And it then becomes to feel more like a marathon instead of a sprint. And that's very disconcerting to people who are grieving. And so while you're grieving and you've got this stress, you're also grieving in this time of COVID restrictions, and that just places an additional layer on your grief. So my heart goes out to all of you, even more so now as you struggle with your own grief as well as COVID-19. So we're going to talk about what is normal in the grief process. And as I've been reflecting on the work I do with grief and experiencing acutely the grief I feel because of COVID-19, I've seen a lot of similarities. So I want to have a discussion with you about that right now. So, unlike the myth of the stages of grief, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief, the grief after the death of a loved one doesn't progress in a very orderly fashion the way that our culture, I think, would have you believe. It's actually quite fluid. It's quite dynamic. Now, Dr. Kubler-Ross put out those 5 stages not based on any kind of scientific research. It was just her observations of what people that she was accompanying in the dying process. She saw that they, generally speaking, experienced these 5 types of emotions. Now, the grief community at that point in time didn't have any kind of framework to describe the grief process. And so they kind of piggybacked on top of it. And it became ingrained in our culture. And it's also quite seductive in the sense that we want to believe that after we experience these 5 emotions, it's tidy, it's neat, and we could then put it away. But the current thinking is that it's not that way at all. There are certain tasks of mourning that each bereaved person have to go through, and we see the actual day-to-day, week-to-week, and sometimes even month-to-month process as generally falling in 3 kind of waves. So I say this tongue-in-cheek, wouldn't it be better to go through 3 waves as opposed to 5 stages? And even the stages concept, we know that we don't experience an emotion and then lock it away. Grief is very cyclical in truth. And every time we revisit an emotion, a thought, we are actually doing it at a much deeper level. The other thing about the 5 stages is that we can't arbitrarily say that everyone is going to experience anger or perhaps deep depression, or go through what we call the bargaining stage. If you have been bereaved before as well, and you're acutely grieving right now, you'll also notice that the 2 grief experiences for 2 different relationships, 2 different people, are going to be different. There's going to be some similarities, but you might have experienced one set of emotions in the grief previously and find yourself not experiencing it now. So that's the other reason why the 5 stages of grieving really doesn't apply to us, because no 2 people are going to grieve alike. Your experience is going to be very different, just like your fingerprint. And even you yourself are not going to find grief experiences that are going to be the same, because your attachment to the people that you've lost in your life is going to be different. So you're going to be grieving the relationships. So having said that, we do know that now grief is more dynamic. It's very changeable. It's unpredictable, and we also don't like that as well, because just like COVID-19, we want it all laid out for us, and we want to be able to say, well, tomorrow I'll be able to go to my church service. And yet we don't know that, and we don't know what's going to come after that, very much like the grief process. So it is very unpredictable. So know that if you feel that way, if you feel that you are losing control, many times I'm told by my clients, I feel like I'm losing my mind. It actually is not the case. It's just that grief has kind of descended upon you and taken the steering wheel away from you right now. You are not in control at this time. So what we then do is manage what we are able to manage, just like COVID-19. So allow me then the opportunity to share with you a model that hopefully will make sense to you. So the first wave of the 3 waves of grief is, we name it, avoidance of reality. So that is the time period immediately after the death of your loved one. Most likely, people will be experiencing what we call psychological or emotional shock. What that means is, we do know on a head level, but we haven't even begun to touch the heart level. So this psychological shock, or what we call a shock absorber, is needed so that you can actually function in those first few days, weeks, and perhaps even months after the death of your loved one. It allows you to make time-sensitive decisions about funeral rituals, services, whether to have one, not have one, how, in terms of disposition of your loved one, what to do immediately after the funeral ritual. So it allows us to actually make those decisions. We need that shock in order for us to start to process the enormity. Because otherwise we'd really be all puddles on the floor. So be grateful for that shock. Now, as time progresses, and what happens also during this time is you'll find the support will gradually fade away. And people go back to their lives, and many times my clients will say, well, I understand that's what's supposed to happen. But it also leaves the bereaved feeling very unsupported and alone in their grief. And then, of course, there's this perception that if people have gone back to their work, to their lives, and they're not supporting you as much as they were immediately after the funeral, then maybe I, as the bereaved person, should be feeling better. But I'm not feeling better. So how is it then does the bereaved person kind of reconcile with that if they've got in their minds, entrenched in their minds, the stages of grief, and that as time goes on, I'm supposed to be feeling better. So once that first stage starts to descend and the shock and numbness start to lift, the thawing begins. And with thawing, has anyone ever experienced when their hands are frozen or very cold and you're numb to it, you can't feel. You know you've got fingers there, but you can't feel. Once it starts to thaw, it starts to tingle and it may hurt. And this then gives rise to the second wave of grief, which is called encounter with reality. So if you think of standing on a beach and a storm comes in, and the storm comes in and you're flooded with waves and you can't go anywhere. You have to stay and sustain that storm. This is the second wave. You're now encountering and facing and having to do the grief work. That's what's necessary in the second wave. So once the shock and numbness have worn out, our feelings actually rise to the surface. Our heart inches a little closer to what the head has known from day one. This is the time when certainly the stages of grief are cracked right open, because now we start to wonder what's going on. Why aren't I feeling better? Time has gone by. I'm feeling worse. And many times clients will contact me for support when they start to experience that. Because again, our culture, our society has basically ingrained in them that as time goes by, you should be feeling better. What do we all say? Just give it time. So while time is not a healer in and of itself, it's how you use the time. So when I'm working with my clients, I normalize this. That it could be a few weeks, it could even be a few months later. But if they're starting to feel it getting worse, it's because it is. And it's the normal process. I just want to give you a little analogy, for example. As an example, if we think of a physical wound to our bodies react by being inflamed, having a period of inflammation, and then the healing takes place. And we can't make that inflammation disappear any quicker. We can't make that bodily response or that wound heal any faster. We can, however, create conditions where that wound heals well. So bringing that back to the grief process, we haven't experienced a physical wound, although it does affect us physically. We've experienced an emotional wound. We've experienced a spiritual wound of a kind. So our reaction then, as somebody who was lovingly attached to this person who died, grief is like our inflammation response to the spiritual or the emotional injury that we've just experienced. And yes, we would like to press the fast forward button and it be all done. But we can't make that wound or that healing go any faster. So while somebody is in this second wave of encounter with reality, so again, the wave is going to rise and then it's going to peak. This is where the myths of grief are shattered. This is where our thoughts that grief should progress in a nice, orderly fashion are shattered. Our feelings are felt more deeply, more acutely. We may cry more. We may start crying. We may become irritable. We may become angry. We may start to review the relationship we had with our loved one. We may start feeling guilt. We may start feeling perhaps relief. But all these feelings now start coming to the surface. And this might be several weeks, as I said, or several months later. And if you've reached out to a grief counselor, reached out to me, I've heard so many times, but I felt so much better then. I remember supporting other people when they came to support me at the funeral. Why am I such a mess right now? You're in a mess right now because the shock and the numbness have worn off. And in a very cruel way, but in a very natural way, your grief is trying to get your attention so that you do tend to the wound. So going back to the analogy of the wound on a part of your body, if you chose not to pay attention to it, it's likely that the wound won't heal properly. It's likely it could cause more issues. It could become infected. And so in the second wave is when a bereaved person is tempted to engage in what we call mourning avoiding behaviors. So what's that? Well, those are behaviors that our brain will talk us into doing so that we don't feel the pain. So it could be anything from keeping busy, indulging in mood-altering substances, moving, releasing your loved one's belongings too quickly because they're too much of a trigger, avoiding talking about them, holding in your emotions if your body naturally needs to cry and you suppress it. Anything that you engage in where you don't face that painful reality. The wonderful thing, though, about this process, and you might find it strange that I use a word such as wonderful, it does give us relief at times. So many times I'll hear my clients say, I'm always crying, or I'm always thinking about him or her. But that isn't possible, actually. Our bodies, first of all, can't cry 24 hours, 7 days. You're probably crying more, or you probably have a need to cry more. So while in the second wave, the reality is kind of your umbrella, or your grief glasses are on. Everything you see is colored by the loss, the death of your loved one. The process actually goes in many waves in every one of the big waves, and it allows us to put it down every so often and pick up what we call life. So I'll give you an example. You wake up in the morning and you think, okay, I can tackle this day. I've got it. I got a handle on it. So you start going about your business to start the day, and immediately the mini grief wave comes over you out of nowhere, and you're profoundly sad, or you become irritable and angry, or you start crying uncontrollably. that will happen. If you do your mourning at that period of time, you will release that pain. You'll feel calmer for that moment, and then you can kind of pick up life, go on with whatever you were doing. So mourning is how I release, or what we call externalize, the feelings and thoughts about how my life is so profoundly changed. So it could come by talking, by crying, and I'm not advocating that everyone cry, because there are some people who don't need to cry. They do not need to heal that way. But if your body naturally needs to cleanse itself that way, if it needs to release your grief feelings that way, then I would strongly encourage you to be courageous enough to go there. Start reflecting on what is it that you're afraid of feeling. Because we don't have to be in that space forever. So the naturalness of the process is that it builds up, we feel the wave, we're overcome by it, we find a way to release it, we release it, it subsides for the moment, we put our grief down, and then we pick up life. Maybe it's to call a friend, maybe it's to do grocery shopping, maybe it's to clean out a closet, whatever needs to be done. And this is how the process unfolds. The more that we resist those mini waves in this second wave of encounter, the more difficult it's going to be for your grief process, the more difficult it's going to be for you, because you're actually going against the naturalness. So we know that grieving after and more is normal after the death of a loved one, somebody that we've been attached to. We also know that mourning is put there in order for us to get through the process. So it's not the time that is going to heal. It's not the time that's going to help you to integrate this loss into your life. It's actually doing the mourning, which is how you use the time to create conditions. If you've got the courage to hold on tight during this second wave, during which I call the storm, okay? This is the storm you're being battered about. And you might look around and you might not see hope. It might be very dark for you. But if you hold on and you do your mourning during this time period, this wave too will start to subside. You'll find yourself coming down on the other side. And what that might look like is the periods of crying might get farther and farther apart. Maybe you don't cry for as long as you used to. Maybe you experience better sleep patterns. Maybe your appetite starts to return to baseline. Maybe you find your energy coming back. Perhaps you now start to accept invitations. Perhaps you even start planning a little more than a day or a week into the future. Maybe you decide you want to return to some activities that you loved before and thought you would never ever engage in after your loved one. That's what the end of the second wave starts to look like. Now, will you feel like yourself? You'll feel like an altered version of yourself. Just like with COVID, we don't know what this new revised life is going to look like. Will we get back to normal? I don't know what normal is going to look like. Will we eventually get back to eating in restaurants? Yeah, hopefully like some other places in Canada and in Ontario, but it's going to look different. It's going to look very different. And so as you enter into this third wave, which is called reconciliation with your new reality. So I don't like to use the word accept. You know, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross used that word as the last stage. And it's not because it's associated with the stage version. It's more in terms of we tend to accept things like a present. And we would never ever accept that it was okay that a beloved child or partner or friend or cousin or mother or father or sibling died. No matter how we cognitively try to justify it, our hearts will always want one more day, so we don't accept it. But what we do is we come to reconcile with it. We come to find a way that we can live in a healthy way. So I like to call it a revised life. There is also research out there that after trauma, that there can be post-traumatic growth. There's lots of research. Human beings are very resilient. And because we have this mechanism, inborn mechanism to mourn, we need to utilize it in order to find our new self again. So this last wave, the wave of reconciliation, is where we start to envision and start to create and start to plan what life is going to look like without the physical presence of our loved one. And we're able to do that more effectively when we have not gotten over, not forgotten, because that's virtually impossible to do, but what we call is to create a continuing bond with our loved one. How do we find a way to remain connected to our loved one, not in a physical sense, but in terms of one of memory or spirit? How can we remain connected to them as we move forward in our new life, but without it being focused on them? Doesn't mean we don't love anymore. It just means that our experience when we think about them is very different than what we experienced in the second wave, which is when everything, all our thoughts, our behavior, our emotions were focused on their absence. In this third wave, we actually are able to come to the realization, for the most part, that we're grateful for that we had their presence. So in the second wave, the focus is on trying to live in their absence and struggling with that. But as we do the grief work of mourning, we come to see that, yes, we'll always miss them. They will always be a part of our lives because of our continuing bond as we move forward, but that we don't have to be focused on them, and we don't have to be connected to them out of pain. Pain is not optional in the grief process. It comes with the package of loving. It's not optional. And it doesn't end quickly, and it can be felt very intensely. And unless you've gone through it and had the courage to feel the depths of that pain, you can never describe it to anyone else. You have to go there yourself and have the courage to feel it. So pain is not optional in the grief process. Suffering, though, is optional, because suffering comes out of pain times resistance. So whenever we resist that pain, we give it more force. We're giving the grief in the second wave more force to get our attention. It's like that bill I tell so many of my clients that we don't want to pay. So we toss it in the drawer and we close the drawer, or we lock it away. But grief won't allow us to do that, because the cost to your physical health, to your mental health, to your relationships, to your relationships at work will suffer as a result. So while I do believe it's never too late to stop and turn back and look at your grief, the sooner that it's done, the better. So in this third wave, where we reconcile, we learn to live as best as we can in their absence. But we do that in ways that they're still present in our life, but not the dominant part of our life. So they're sort of integrated into our life. They're part of our life story. So if you were married for 35 years, then they occupied 35 chapters of your life, and they will continue to be part of the rest of your narrative and your story, but it's not going to be the focus. And so that's basically how I would prefer to describe grief. And while we never get over it, and I'm going to take you back to the analogy of standing at the beach. If you're still on that beach and the storm has passed, and you're now in the reconciliation wave, and the waves are subsiding, they're coming farther and farther apart, but there's always going to be ripples because they represent your love. So that you take with you as you move forward, so you don't get over it. Those little waves that may be at your ankles, or in times of distress, or at times during the year when you're triggered at Christmas or at special holidays. The waves may get a little higher, and that's okay. That's okay, because you've already established your good foundation, because you've done your mourning. So I prefer to look at grief as in this way, that there's a naturalness to it. Not that I prefer, we all know that there's a naturalness to it, but I prefer to look at it in terms of the three waves, that it's very fluid and it's very dynamic, and that unfortunately for those of you who are acutely grieving, it can feel worse because it starts to settle. So in the third wave, our heart very reluctantly moves up to the level of what our head knew all along from day one. So those are the three waves. So I'm just looking here. We do have a question or a comment from Karen. In the second wave, when you feel everyone's life went back to normal and yours hasn't, it's been 8 months since my husband died, and it's like I'm lost and walking in circles. It's like life is going on around me and I'm a bystander watching it. Can you offer advice? That is so true, Karen. First of all, I'm very sorry about the death of your husband, and you've described it quite adequately. So I described it as being in the middle of a storm. You kind of described it as being going around in circles, and sometimes maybe even feeling like you're digging a hole. And when you look around and you see that others have gone back to their normal lives, and you are now left with your routines, and that's when it starts to hit the most. Any routines that are attached to or connected to your husband are going to raise your grief feelings. So yeah, you are probably in that second wave right now. You're in the midst of the storm. So I'd really encourage you to have the courage to go with those mini waves, okay? When you feel it overcoming you, I want you to stop. I want you to allow yourself to release whatever that thought, that emotion is. And you will, if you're a crier, you will find some relief after that, because actually stress is being relieved. We know that tears of sadness and pain actually release stress chemicals. So if you are naturally a crier and you try to repress it because of messages you've been told or beliefs you hold about crying, then you're actually maintaining the stress in your body. So, Karen, if you are a crier, cry it out. Find people who are still willing to walk with you in that journey. Reach out to them. Maybe you need to talk it out. What about writing it out? You might want to write letters to your husband about what you're going through. That's how we do our mourning. One of the things we also could experience, and I'm not certainly suggesting you're experiencing this, but I'm just generally putting it out there, that when we see other people going back to their lives, we could feel very jealous and envious, perhaps even angry. And those are very, very legitimate feelings, very, very normal. That too, those very uncomfortable feelings. We're not comfortable with jealousy and envy. We're not comfortable admitting it, let alone voicing it outside of us. But those also have to be externalized. You have to be able to say, yeah, I feel this. And every time you feel it, keep saying it and mourning it outside of yourself, and then it'll fade. You'll diffuse it actually that way. I'd encourage you to reach out for support, and this is a very difficult time. You can't go to a support group, you can't see people personally, and I'm very sorry for that, because as I said, that adds another layer to your grief. So I encourage you to find alternative ways, more creative ways to reach out for support, and have hope and faith that you will get through it. And right now, break it down to moment by moment living, right? Just at this moment, what am I going to do? Maybe right now, all you have to do is breathe in and breathe out. And when you feel that grief wave, allow yourself to go with that. So I hope that helps, Karen. So much like COVID, or much like the grief process, we're going through a grief, right? We're going through, things have been taken away from us. Both real losses we've experienced, and we've also experienced symbolic losses. And symbolic losses with COVID are things like opportunity, but real losses are things like our freedom, decision making, our freedom to jump on a plane and go and visit relatives or go for a holiday. Those things are taken away. So much like grief, the real loss is the physical absence of your loved one, but symbolic losses are intangible and things that other people don't see or don't realize. That might be something like loss of identity, loss of opportunity, loss of future dreams. Those are intangible losses that also have to be grieved. And so that's why the grief process is not quick and easy. So much like grieving after the death of a loved one, as a community, we're also going through a grief process. And I don't know where we're at right now. I'm not sure where in the three waves we're at. I mean, as restrictions are lifted across the province, we see other municipalities come, I think, the end of this week, being able to engage more in activities that we did. They're able to gather in bigger crowds, go out to restaurants. But of course, it's going to be done differently. But here in Windsor, Essex, we're not able to do that yet. So where would we be? Are we still in in the encounter with reality. And boy, we're running short of patience, aren't we? I know myself. I became impatient a long time ago. As I told you when we started chatting, 10 weeks ago, I thought by June or July, by June, I thought by May, I thought by June certainly, because here we are sitting in the middle of June, that I'd be doing Grieving Hearts with a live audience. So, what's patience? What does that mean? Well, that's the state of being patient, practicing. So, patience is really the ability to bear with or tolerate adversity or pain with a calm outlook, without complaint, to withstand hardship without complaint, understanding that there's certain things that is not within our control, that we have to yield to something bigger than ourselves. In the case of death after a loved one, it's yielding to the naturalness of death, even a death that might have been out of time or much earlier than we ever would have imagined because we hadn't finished our story yet. But that's out of our control, just like this virus is not within our control. It's out there and it's touching every part of our life, much like grief. So what is within our control? Well, we can follow the restrictions. We can follow the guidelines. We don't have to like it, but we can follow it. And we can learn to understand that this too shall end. It will end at some point. Life will look different, just like after the death of a loved one, it will look different. But we have to also hold out hope. And so we need to cultivate patience, because again, if we're not patient, that's equivalent to being resistant to the grief process. It's equivalent to being it's equivalent to going against the wave instead of going with the wave. So with patience, we have to also hold hope. And much like grief, that slows us down. It fatigues us. It tires us out. It slows our thinking down. Have you ever wondered why you can't make decisions? Why you can't remember things? Because it's slowing everything down. It's slowing us down so that we can absorb the naturalness and absorb the reality of our life. Much like COVID, right? It has slowed us down. It has slowed us down. Now we wait. Now we wait wherever we go. We wait at the bank. We wait for groceries. We have to wait. And this is very much foreign to our hurry up and get well culture, isn't it? Right? Are you feeling better now? Are you over it yet? It's been a few weeks. It's been a few months. I'm sure you're over the death of your loved one. But this process, the COVID process, has had to slow us down. You know, as I'm driving here down Dougal to come to Signature Tributes to tape this, I remember April 2nd when we did our first one, and there was hardly anybody on the streets. There's of course a little bit more traffic now, and it just felt so eerily. It just felt so strange. It felt that I was in a kind of a time warp. There wasn't this franticness. And so much like grief, we have to give in to the process and slow down and cultivate perhaps not only patience but other activities. Karen, you're very welcome, Karen. Karen also asked, do I have any ideas to help my 12-year-old son with Father's Day. Yeah, that's extremely, it's going to be an extremely difficult time. So depending on your son and what he's like, generally speaking, I would strongly encourage you to mark Father's Day. Yes, he does not have a father here physically any longer, but he has a father. He has a father who I'm presuming played a very important and critical role in his young life. So while I would never say, how did you celebrate Father's Day? As someone who's worked with people grieving, I would ask you, how are you going to mark Father's Day? So what I mean by that is that we acknowledge that even though your son doesn't have a father physically here, we're not going to pretend that because it's Father's Day, his death didn't happen. We're not going to pretend that Father's Day isn't coming next weekend. But it's going to be different, and it's going to be painful. So I'd encourage you to talk to your son and ask him what he'd like to do for Father's Day. Perhaps you want to order in Dad's favorite meal for Father's Day. Perhaps you want to make a special meal, his favorite meal. But I would encourage you to mark it in some way. It doesn't have to be the focus of that day. Maybe you could mark it, and then if it's a nice day, you can go for a walk or a bike ride. So whatever way seems natural and right to you, I would encourage you to do that. But know that it is going to be difficult, definitely. Tricia says, thank you for doing this. I am really missing the Grieving Hearts sessions in person. Me too, Tricia. Really, me too. I miss the face-to-face interaction. I miss the nodding. Even if you didn't ask me a question, you'd nod or you'd smile, or you might even cry. And then I would say, see, you're doing your morning. So I do miss that. And you know, Jen and I were talking about it just before we went live. You know, what's that going to look like when these restrictions are lifted? We're all very hopeful that we'll be able to get back to Grieving Hearts. We see this as an extremely important service to the community, bereaved community of Windsor and Essex County, and I, for one, would love to continue doing this. And so let's hold on to hope, Tricia, that we can. So we have another question. Terry says, my husband passed April 30th. Wow. And we were married 1 year and 9 months. Our second anniversary is coming up on June 23rd. Do you have any suggestions for me? I'm so sorry, Terry. Your story certainly wasn't finished, was it? And I'm sure it was very much like Karen's. Her story, her love story with her husband wasn't finished either. And I would certainly venture to guess that your story wasn't finished after 1 year and 9 months. This too will be painful. It will sting. You will most probably, you may question why. You most probably will review the time, the married time that you had together, let alone your relationship, and that's okay. And it may bring profound sadness, it may bring tears, and that's okay too. Just as I suggested to Karen, find a way to mark, to acknowledge your second anniversary, or what would have been your second anniversary. It's still an important day. And since your husband only died in April, you're still very much acutely grieving. And so it will hold a lot of pain for you. But I'd like you to acknowledge it. Acknowledge the losses, the lost dreams, and perhaps in some way find a connection to your husband. Whatever again that might mean to you. Whatever special thing that maybe only the two of you knew, or maybe a small circle of family or friends knew that would know that it was meaningful. So without knowing your story, I'd encourage you to give it some thought between now and I guess next week, and somehow mark that day. Also understand the days and weeks and the months sometimes leading up to a significant day is usually worse than the actual day itself. And that's because our anticipation, our anxiety for that day usually carries with it more angst than the actual day itself. So understand that day, while it's significant, really shouldn't be any more painful than the day that he died. It's going to feel more painful because his absence is going to be more pronounced now. But you have also survived the worst day, which was the day that he died. So that day actually might not be as bad as the days and the weeks leading up to that. So mark it in some way, acknowledge it, accept whatever you experience that day, with the exception of harm to oneself or anyone else. Everything is quite normal. Okay? You're most welcome, Terry. Take care. Are there any other questions or comments? I see that we're about 7:20. I would encourage you to, Dave just signed in. Hi, my dad passed away April 28th, 2020. I'm sorry, Dave. I'm sorry because that tells me also, just like Terry, that you also weren't able to engage in the normal funeral rituals. And so that adds another layer to this grief experience, another level of pain. And you weren't afforded the normal traditions. You weren't afforded the normal supports also because of COVID-19 restrictions. And I'm very sorry for that. So know that your grief journey is actually beginning. Again, there's no time frame for any of these waves. They come in generally in 3 waves, but as you might have noticed, I haven't assigned any time for it. So it will unfold for you, Dave, just the way it's supposed to. It could be a little bit more complicated because of the additional restrictions of COVID-19. But as Terry had mentioned, Father's Day is coming up, so I'd encourage you to find ways to mark it in whatever would be most meaningful for you and for him. So take care. Justine said that my mother died May 2nd. So Justine, you too are experiencing not only the stress of grief, but having to grieve under these extraordinary circumstances. So you too will have to practice patience. You too will have to become creative in the way that you reach out and gain the support. There is support out there. There is support. It's just it'll be different than what you imagined it would be. So take care, Justine. Sarith, I hope I pronounced it correctly. You have been widowed for 9 months. Do you have some morning mantras or words of affirmation for when it feels like you're treading water? Having 3 kids home with no breaks has thrown a wrench in my grieving process. That is so true. That's so true. So that really is another prime example of how COVID is impacting your grief and making this so much more challenging. So while children can ground us, can give us a reason for getting up in the morning, it can be a double-edged sword, because we also have to pay attention to them, and then not and sometimes forget about our grieving needs. So I do like the question in terms of how do I start my morning, and that's a wonderful way. Well, I would suggest some what we call deep square or circle breathing. So taking in a deep breath from the diaphragm to a count of 3 or 4, holding it in for 2 or 3, and slowly releasing. If you can do that, that will center yourself. And then affirmations like, I will do the very best I can today. I will take whatever the day brings, and I will handle it. Depending on the age of your children, if you can find 5 or 10 minutes, even if it's in the bathroom, I would encourage you to do that, because you can't really pack away your grief. While you may be distracted, and rightly so, with homeschooling, you need to also find times to weave in moments of grief. But if you can start the day that way, I can do this. I'm capable of this. I can do it for today. I can do it for this moment. Hopefully that will set the right tone for your day, but also be okay that it's going to go off track, because grief is going to get a hold of you. Your kids, your children are 3, 9, and 13. Wow. Is it possible, right, that your 13-year-old, and I don't want to burden the 13-year-old, or is it possible that, a family member can come and take them at some point during the day, so that you carve out a space for your grief? You can do it first thing in the morning, last thing at night, but also finding times, because grief doesn't just disappear during the day when we go to work, when we have to homeschool. It's there, and it will try to get your attention. It'll try to come to the surface. So if you can put other things aside that are not that critical, and carve out little pieces of segments of time during your day, if it's possible. If it's not, then we'd have to look at another creative way of getting your grief needs met. Okay? But it is very important that you do pay attention, because children have a way of distracting us and lull us into the impression that we're dealing well with it. But all the while, the grief is still there under the surface. So I do appreciate that you seem to understand the naturalness and the normalcy of attending to your grief. So take care of yourself. So we are winding down. I hope that this has been helpful. I've enjoyed doing this Grieving Hearts in a different way. This is it for the summer, because we usually would have taken a summer break. However, grief doesn't stop in the summer. It might look a little different with COVID-19, but know that your grief will accompany you, and you still have to pay attention to it. You still have to acknowledge it, because it's getting your attention for a reason. So I wish you all the very best. I wish you the courage to mourn, to feel your pain, to release it, to pick it up again, as long as it keeps getting your attention. I wish you the very best in your journey, and I wish you hope, and I wish you peace. Thank you so much.